There was a time when these resorts were alive. Not just open, but breathing. Music drifted through marble halls. Champagne glasses clinked under crystal chandeliers, and suitcases rolled across polished floors that never knew dust. Villas perched above coastlines like kings watching their kingdoms. Estates hidden in forests welcomed guests who arrived by train, carriage, and later, gleaming automobiles. Then tourism changed its mind. The travelers who once stayed for entire seasons stopped coming. Air travel made vacations faster, cheaper, and disposable. Why spend months in one estate when you could cross continents in hours? The grand resorts weren't built for speed. They were built for waiting, for slow mornings, long dinners, and traditions that suddenly felt old. Economic crashes arrived quietly but stayed loudly. Staff vanished first. Then, fountains stopped running. Entire wings were closed. Temporarily. A word that would stretch into decades. Wars redirected tourists elsewhere, borders tightened, and fear replaced leisure. The buildings remained, standing tall and confused, as if expecting guests who would never return. Luxury, without money, rots faster than poverty. Roofs leaked. Salt air chewed through iron balconies. Vines crawled across ballroom doors, patient and unstoppable. What was once cleaned daily now grew mold like a living thing. In some villas, mirrors still hang on the walls, reflecting nothing but shadows, as if waiting to remember faces. Locals began to avoid these places. At night, wind moved through broken windows and sounded like footsteps. Old elevators dropped suddenly, though no one had touched them in years. Some swear the resorts never fully emptied, that echoes of laughter still slip through the halls when the fog rolls in from the sea. Tourism didn't destroy these places with fire or force. It simply forgot them. New destinations rose, cheaper hotels stacked higher. Experiences shortened into weekend memories. The estates were left frozen in time, too large to save, too expensive to revive, and too beautiful to demolish easily. Now they sit in silence, monuments to a world that traveled differently. Resorts without reservations, villas without voices, estates that once hosted life and now host only the slow, unsettling sound of decay. They were not built for crowds. These golden age resorts were designed for a very specific kind of visitor. People whose money had history, whose names were already known long before they ever arrived. Old money did not rush, and neither did the architecture. The entrances were wide and deliberate, meant for carriages first, automobiles later. Staff learned family lineages the way others learned room numbers. Guests were not asked how long they would stay, because everyone already knew. It would be weeks, sometimes an entire season. These resorts existed in places chosen as much for isolation as for beauty. Clifftops overlooking quiet seas, forests far from industrial cities, mountain valleys where silence was considered a luxury. Getting there was part of the experience. Trains slowed as they approached. Winding roads forced arrivals to look, to anticipate. By the time guests stepped inside, the outside world already felt distant, unimportant. Everything inside reinforced permanence. Floors were marble not because it impressed, but because it lasted. Wood paneling was carved from trees that took centuries to grow. Furniture was commissioned, not purchased. Even the layout assumed familiarity. Guests wandered without signs, because returning families already knew where the dining hall was, where the gardens opened, where the best views waited at sunset. Old money tourism was built on ritual. Breakfasts happened at the same hour every morning. Afternoons belonged to walking paths and quiet conversation. Evenings demanded formal wear, not for display, but because it had always been done that way. These resorts were less like hotels and more like private worlds, sealed off from time, repeating the same season again and again. The staff were part of that world too. Generations worked the same estate, passing knowledge down quietly. They remembered preferred rooms, remembered how certain guests liked the curtains drawn, the fire lit, the wine served. Nothing was hurried. Nothing was improvised. The illusion was that this place would exist forever, unchanged. But that illusion depended on one fragile thing: people who traveled slowly and stayed long. When wealth began to move differently, when new money wanted novelty instead of tradition, these resorts suddenly felt heavy. Too formal, too quiet, too rooted. The very features that once defined their exclusivity became warnings of stagnation. The buildings, however, never adapted. They could not. They were monuments to a time when tourism was about belonging, not escaping. And when that world began to fade, the resorts were left standing exactly as they were built, waiting for guests who no longer existed, holding on to luxury that had lost its audience. The change did not arrive like a storm. It came quietly, almost politely, disguised as progress. Airplanes began to shrink the world, and travel that once required planning, patience, and money with roots became something fast, affordable, and impulsive. Destinations were no longer chosen for seasons, but for weekends. The journey stopped mattering. Only the arrival did. The new traveler did not want to stay in one place long enough to learn its rhythms. They wanted options, movement, variety. Today a beach, tomorrow a city, next week another country entirely. The old resorts were built like anchors, meant to hold people in place. Their long corridors, slow service, and formal routines suddenly felt suffocating to a generation raised on speed. Tourism turned visual. Travelers wanted views they could capture instantly, experiences they could compress into photographs and short memories. Golden Age resorts offered something harder to sell: atmosphere, silence, continuity. There were no neon signs, no dramatic attractions, no constant entertainment. What they offered required time, and time had become expensive in a new way. Budget airlines rewrote geography. Places once considered remote lost their mystique, as hundreds of destinations competed for attention. A villa on a quiet coast could no longer justify its isolation when cheaper, louder, more accessible resorts promised excitement and convenience. Travel became about efficiency, not devotion to a single place. New money reshaped expectations. Guests no longer wanted inherited traditions, they wanted personalization, novelty, and control. Fixed dining hours, formal dress codes, and unchanging routines felt outdated, even restrictive. What had once signaled refinement now suggested inflexibility. The resorts did not bend, and the travelers did not wait. Tourism also became transactional. Loyalty faded. Guests stopped returning year after year. Instead of forming emotional ties to a place, they collected destinations like trophies. The old estates relied on familiarity, on being remembered and revisited. Without repeat visitors, their entire economic foundation cracked. And so relevance vanished almost overnight. Not because the resorts became worse, but because the world began to want something entirely different. The buildings still stood in perfect locations, filled with craftsmanship no modern hotel could afford, Yet they belonged to a slower version of humanity. As travel rushed forward, these places remained behind, frozen in elegance, watching relevance slip away, without ever understanding why. Wealth always looks permanent until it isn't. The resorts learned this the hard way. Economic crashes did not announce themselves with warnings. They arrived suddenly, like a door slammed shut somewhere far away, and the effects traveled silently until they reached these distant estates. Investments vanished. Fortunes tied to railroads, shipping, steel, and land dissolved almost overnight. Families who once booked entire floors now sent quiet letters canceling. For the foreseeable future. When money tightened, luxury became dangerous. Staying visible felt reckless. Grand holidays turned into symbols of excess, and many wealthy patrons withdrew from public life. The resorts that depended on their presence felt the absence immediately. Empty dining rooms echoed louder than crowds ever had. Staff were kept on, just in case. But weeks turned into months, and the rooms stayed dark. Wars were even more final. Borders hardened. Trains stopped running. Ships were repurposed. The long, elegant routes that once carried guests directly to these resorts were broken or destroyed. Some villas found themselves suddenly too close to conflict zones, others completely cut off by blockades and restrictions. Even those far from the fighting were affected. Fear travels faster than bullets. Wealthy families did not vanish, but their priorities changed. Money moved toward survival, toward rebuilding, toward safety. Estates abroad became liabilities. Returning year after year to the same resort felt uncertain, even irresponsible. Many never came back, not because they didn't want to, but because the world no longer allowed it. Some resorts were seized, repurposed, or occupied. Ballrooms became hospitals. Guest rooms turned into offices or barracks. Furniture was burned for warmth. Marble cracked under heavy boots. When the wars ended, the damage was not just physical. The spell was broken. These places had seen something they were never meant to witness. Even after peace returned, the flow of wealthy visitors never fully recovered. New financial systems emerged, new destinations rose. And the old social networks that fed these resorts were fractured beyond repair. Entire generations who once considered these estates part of their yearly lives were gone, replaced by heirs who had no emotional connection to them. The buildings waited, as they always had, but the world that supported them had collapsed quietly elsewhere. Economic crashes and wars didn't destroy the resorts outright. They simply cut the invisible lifelines: money, movement, confidence, leaving these grand places standing, intact but hollow, unable to recover what had been lost. Luxury was never cheap, but in these resorts it was engineered to be constant. Every surface demanded care. Marble floors needed polishing, even when no one walked on them. Roofs had to be repaired before they leaked, not after. Gardens required daily attention, or they would immediately begin to unravel. When guests disappeared, the buildings did not become cheaper to maintain, they became more dangerous. At first, corners were cut carefully. One wing closed. A fountain turned off. Chandeliers left unlit to save power. Staff numbers were reduced, but the work did not disappear. Fewer hands tried to preserve the illusion that everything was still under control. The resorts began to feel tired, like something aging without rest. Luxury materials age differently than ordinary ones. When neglected, they don't fade quietly. They decay dramatically. Gilded ceilings flaked instead of cracking. Heavy drapes trapped moisture and grew heavy with mold. Wood paneling warped, split, and groaned at night as temperatures shifted. Every small failure created a larger one waiting behind it. These buildings were never designed to be partially alive. Their systems were interconnected, dependent on constant use. Shut down the heating in one section, and condensation crept through the walls. Stop regular cleaning and insects moved in, followed by rodents. Once maintenance slowed, deterioration accelerated, feeding on itself. Money became a cruel calculation. Each year, owners faced impossible choices: repair the roof or the plumbing, restore the facade or keep the lights on. Selling became difficult. Few buyers wanted buildings that consumed wealth just to stand still. Insurance costs rose. Taxes didn't disappear. What had once symbolized success now behaved like a debt that never slept. There was also pride. Owners delayed closure because admitting failure felt worse than bleeding slowly. They convinced themselves revival was coming next season. Next year, after the economy recovered, after tourism returned. Meanwhile, water seeped into walls, rust bloomed behind decorative ironwork, and foundations quietly weakened. Eventually, maintenance stopped being prevention and became damage control. Emergency fixes replaced careful preservation. Temporary solutions became permanent scars. The resorts began to look haunted not because of ghosts, but because they were dying in pieces, unevenly, unpredictably. Luxury had promised permanence, but without constant care it became a slow execution. These places were not destroyed by vandals or disasters. They were undone by the simple fact that beauty, when neglected, does not remain beautiful. It rots slowly, expensively, and without mercy. Nature did not rush. It never does. The first signs were small enough to ignore. A hairline crack in stone where rainwater settled. A vine testing the edge of a balcony. Weeds pushing through gravel paths once raked daily. At first, the villas still looked intact, proud even, as if abandonment were only temporary. Nature was patient enough to let them believe that. Without human interruption, the land remembered what it used to be. Roots spread beneath foundations, searching for moisture, slowly prying stone apart from below. Ivy climbed walls not as decoration, but as invasion, slipping into window frames, lifting roof tiles just enough to invite water inside. Trees leaned closer each year, their branches scratching walls like fingers testing for weakness. Gardens were the first to fall. What had once been carefully designed symmetry collapsed into chaos. Flower beds turned wild, paths vanished under moss, fountains filled with stagnant water and leaves. Birds nested where guests once sat. Insects claimed corners that had not known silence in decades. The line between inside and outside began to blur. Water did the most damage quietly. Rain slipped through cracked roofs and broken gutters, soaking wood that had been sealed and polished for generations. Floors buckled. Ceilings sagged. Mold spread in patterns that looked deliberate, almost artistic, dark stains blooming like shadows that refused to leave. Each season made the damage deeper, more permanent. Animals followed. Small ones first, rats, bats, insects. Then larger creatures once feared disappeared. Deer walked through open doors. Foxes slept in former guest rooms. In some estates, entire ecosystems formed indoors, life adapting to chandeliers and staircases, as if they were cliffs and caves. The buildings began to sound alive again, but differently. Wind howled through empty halls. branches scraped against glassless windows. At night the structures shifted, wood popping, stone settling, echoes moving where no footsteps existed. Locals started to avoid these places, uneasy with how quickly nature had rewritten them. Nature was not cruel. It did not destroy out of anger. It simply reclaimed what had been borrowed. The villas and estates had interrupted forests, coastlines, hillsides, and once human attention vanished, the land moved in to correct the imbalance. What remained was a strange fusion. Architecture half swallowed, beauty tangled with decay. Balconies wrapped in vines, staircases leading into trees, rooms open to the sky. These abandoned resorts became reminders that no matter how grand the design, no structure is permanent without people. Left alone, even luxury eventually returns to earth, one route, one crack, one season at a time. Long after the guests disappeared, the locals remained. They watched the resorts change from landmarks into warnings. At first, people spoke about them openly, how beautiful they once were, who used to stay there, how much life they brought to the area. But as the buildings darkened and silence settled in, the conversations grew quieter, more careful. Stories began with practical explanations. Someone heard footsteps, probably animals. Lights appeared briefly at night, just reflections, kids with flashlights, wind moving old fixtures. Doors found open after being shut. Weather, nothing more. But repetition turned coincidence into discomfort. When the same things happened again and again, people stopped laughing them off. Children were the first to feel it. They refused to play near the estates, insisting they were being watched. Dogs barked at empty windows and refused to enter open gates. Hunters avoided the woods nearby. Fishermen swore the water felt wrong close to abandoned waterfront villas. Quieter, heavier. Rumors layered over one another. Some said caretakers died alone inside after refusing to leave. Others claimed wealthy guests vanished during wars or epidemics. Their rooms sealed and never reopened. There were whispers of hidden tunnels, locked rooms. Safes still untouched, because no one wanted to go inside long enough to open them. At night, the resorts seemed to perform. Wind turned hallways into corridors of sound. Loose shutters slammed like distant doors. Fog pooled around entrances, as if the buildings were exhaling. Locals passing by felt watched, not by something moving, but by something that remembered. No one needed proof. The unease was enough. These places felt wrong in a way that didn't require belief in ghosts. They were reminders of a past that ended badly, of wealth that left without cleaning up after itself. People avoided them out of respect, fear, or superstition, often all three. The buildings became silent characters in the community, never mentioned directly, only referenced with a glance or lowered voice. That place up the hill. The old hotel by the water. Names were forgotten on purpose. What haunted the locals wasn't the idea of spirits. It was the feeling that something unfinished remained inside. That the resorts were still waiting, still expecting footsteps, still holding memories that refused to fade. And so people stayed away, letting the structures decay in peace, convinced that some doors were better left unopened. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It stretched in slowly, filling spaces that had once been crowded with sound. First, the music stopped. Then the laughter. Then the everyday noise of life. The clatter of dishes. The murmur of conversations in multiple languages. The soft rhythm of footsteps moving through halls. What remained felt unnatural, like a pause that never ended. These places were built to echo with people. Without them, every room felt oversized, every corridor too long. Sound behaved strangely. A single footstep carried too far. A dropped object startled like a gunshot. Even wind moving through broken windows sounded deliberate, as if the building itself was trying to speak. Staff were the last voices to disappear. A caretaker locking doors that no one would open again. A gardener trimming hedges that no one would walk past. Eventually, even those routines ended. Keys were handed in. Gates closed for the final time. After that, silence became permanent. Outside, life continued. New hotels opened elsewhere. Roads redirected traffic away. Tour buses stopped passing by. The resorts were left off maps, then forgotten entirely. Silence thickened as fewer people had reasons to come near. What had once been a destination became a void. Inside, the quiet preserved everything in an unsettling way. Furniture remained exactly where it was last used. Menus lay open on tables. Guest registers stopped mid-line, names unfinished. Time felt suspended, as if the buildings were holding their breath, waiting for a sound that would never return. Locals felt the change deeply. The absence of tourism meant fewer lights at night, fewer voices drifting across water or valleys. Places that once felt alive after sunset became dark and still. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, filled with the memory of what used to be there. Over time, the silence became the defining feature. Visitors who accidentally wandered in spoke, in whispers without realizing why. Even birds avoided nesting in certain rooms, as if the quiet itself had weight. These resorts no longer felt abandoned. They felt paused, frozen in a moment that stretched endlessly. When tourism moved on, it didn't just leave empty buildings behind. It left behind a silence that settled into the walls, soaked into the floors, and lingered long after everything else had gone. A silence that doesn't fade, only waits. And so these places remain not truly dead, but no longer alive. Resorts, villas, and estates built to be filled with movement now exist only as stillness. They stand where the world once stopped on purpose, now ignored as the world rushes past. What makes them unsettling isn't decay alone. It's the feeling that they were designed to be remembered, yet were abandoned without farewell. Tourism didn't destroy them with force. It simply stopped looking back. And in that abandonment, these grand structures became something else entirely. Witnesses to a slower humanity that no longer exists. When the wind moves through their halls, it carries echoes that were never meant to last this long. The silence holds memory. The walls remember footsteps, voices, music. These resorts were not built to end this way, but they endure anyway, quiet, watching, waiting, long after the travelers have gone.